Hello everyone. Long ago, long before this channel was ever monetized or even noticed by any more than a handful of viewers, I made one of my first long nostalgic game reviews about the Ninja Gaiden series. This was back when I was first teaching myself to edit, and it is admittedly primitive, but I'd encourage you all to watch it. The link is in the description. I talked about Ninja Gaiden because it was representative of an era when ninjas dominated entertainment in film, on TV, and especially in video games. But there was another ninja-themed video game series I'd long wanted to make a video about, and this seems the time to do it since I don't want the channel to get too bogged down in, shall we say, current events. The series I'm talking about is Sega's Shinobi. If you visited arcades or even just supermarkets or convenience stores in the late 80s or early 90s, you would have undoubtedly seen this game. It would later have several sequels and spin-offs on home systems, and it even had a reboot in the 21st century on the PlayStation 2. For the sake of brevity, however, I'm only going to cover mainly the games that I actually played, which incidentally were the most popular in the series. Shinobi released in arcades in 1987 using the Sega 16 hardware system and took inspiration from a game released the previous year called Rolling Thunder. In that game, stages typically featured two levels which the player and enemies could switch between by jumping. The player could also duck into doors to evade enemies. This was innovative for the time since it gave a sense of depth to what was otherwise a 2D platformer. With this groundwork laid, Shinobi took a similar route. The player could jump normally, but pressing up and jump allowed the player to either jump to a higher level or into the background behind a fence to avoid or engage enemies. Enemies could not be hit if they were on the other plane in the background. Another feature I really came to appreciate was that although your character could only take one hit, they must be hit by a weapon or attack. Remember, this was a time when in most games your players would take damage or even die simply by touching an enemy. In the original Shinobi, you play as Joe Musashi, a ninja of the Oboro clan, fighting against a terrorist organization known as Zed. Man, what is it with evil terrorist in that letter, huh? Anyway, Joe isn't your average ninja. He doesn't wear a mask because he will not comply. Nah, just kidding. Seriously though, each of the game's 5 missions is divided into 1 or 2 different stages plus a boss stage, and between missions is a bonus stage where you can try to earn an extra life. Throughout each stage, you must rescue a certain number of hostages. Since the stages are more or less linear, you won't have much trouble finding them. Rescuing a certain hostage will grant you a power-up that lets you use a handgun instead of your usual throwing stars. This is a mechanic you'll see in more or less the same fashion in all the games I'm going to reference here. Typically, your powered-up weapon will not only do more damage to enemies who take 2 or 3 hits, but it will also punch through any armor or shield they might have. The downside in Shinobi, however, is that if you die after rescuing the power-up hostage, you can't get it again in that stage. Finally, another feature Shinobi introduced, which carried into all the other games, is ninja magic, sometimes referred to as ninjutsu in the game. If things get too hairy, you can mash the magic button and clear the screen of enemies one time. It can also be used to finish off a boss. Speaking of bosses, Shinobi had some really interesting ones as well. The first boss is just this armored samurai warrior guy, but in the second mission you'll face a Huey helicopter dropping ninjas while firing its rocket pods at you. The third boss is a combination of Buddhist statues and some kind of cybernetic face computer. The fourth boss is yet another samurai, but get a load of his name. And I'll tell you right now, if you think this is the only character named Lobster in this series, you've got another thing coming. Finally, you'll face Nakahara, the masked ninja and leader of Zed. And one peculiarity of this game is that on the final level, you can't just pop in more coins to continue. When you're done, you're done. I saw and played this game a lot as a kid, and while I found it to be very difficult, I always had an attraction to it. One of the most memorable features of the game for me was the music, which seemed to combine East Asian sounds with jazz, and it's been instantly recognizable for me my whole life. Music would remain a key feature of the Shinobi games, and I can't remember a single one that didn't have at least one very catchy and memorable tune. The bonus stage, while difficult, was fun to play, and the graphics you see here were pretty amazing for their day. I think what made Shinobi so great is that it introduced more advanced tactics to the platforming genre. You have to understand that in these days, a lot of platforming games basically had you just facing one way in shooting or facing the other way in shooting. You just run and gun or punch and kick your way from one side of the screen to another. In Shinobi, you'd come up against real obstacles. For example, enemies using shields protecting other enemies that could still shoot at you. At times, you may have to utilize the upper level to flank these enemies or approach them at close range to use your melee attacks. These common pistol-wielding enemies always have to reload their weapon after a set amount of shots, giving you a chance to hit them or approach them. On the other hand, some of them can go prone, meaning your throwing stars will go right over their head even if you're crouching. Every level will have straightforward sections where you can just take out a bunch of mindless enemies, but usually around hostages you'll run into these choke points guarded by enemies with shields. You can always use your ninja magic to clear the way, but you may find you need it later. Now, a weird thing about Shinobi is that it had a lot of ports, but not where you'd expect. It was ported to the Sega Master System and various personal computers, and there was an NES knockoff version from Tengen. That Nintendo version makes things a little easier by giving you a health bar, and I have to say it really helped me get into the game by smoothing out the difficulty curve a bit. Oddly enough though, the game wasn't released for Sega's 16-bit Genesis or Mega Drive system, which would appear only a year after Shinobi was released. Instead, the Genesis would introduce one of the game's first sequels, but this is where things get a little complicated and branch off, so I'll cover that a little later. For now, let's talk about direct sequels. In the arcade, that would be Shadow Dancer. Shadow Dancer brought much better looking graphics while adding a unique new mechanic. In the arcade game, you play as Joe Musashi's son, Hayate, and you have your ninja dog, Yamato, that can be used to attack and hold enemies so you can kill them more easily or handle another threat. I never used a dog very often, but at least it was more useful than this Yamato. Other than that, everything is essentially the same, with most enemies merely being cosmetically different from those in the original game. The bonus stages between missions remain, only this time you've got ninjas trying to jump off a building and Mario stomp your ass. Shadow Dancer seems to have been much rarer than Shinobi. The only time I ever encountered a cabinet was in the massive arcade inside Circus Circus in Las Vegas. It was a pretty challenging game and I never really got very far in it, but years later in high school I got into emulation and played through the whole thing. Shadow Dancer got a separate port for the Sega Genesis called Shadow Dancer: The Secret of Shinobi, and it was one of the first games I got when I received my own Genesis console. Although the graphics couldn't compete with the arcade machine, Sega compensated by creating a very different game while still maintaining some of the key features and mechanics. In fact, they even improved a lot of things. For example, in the arcade game, if you duck and press attack, it sicks your dog on the nearest enemy you're facing. This is a problem because some enemies can actually hurt your dog unless you sick them when they're vulnerable. The Genesis port gives you this special attack gauge, and you hold and release the attack button to sick the dog. This way he doesn't get injured. In case you're wondering, if your dog is injured, he shrinks into a useless puppy, but you can get him back when you either disarm the bomb in the arcade version or rescue a hostage in the home port. This version of the game also provides you with more of a story. Basically, Joe Musashi's back after defeating Zed, but now he faces an evil organization known as, get ready for this, Union Lizard. Not even kidding. The Genesis port is generous with extra lives, which can be found hidden in the scenery or earned via the bonus stage, where a perfect score will earn you 3 extra lives. This may be one of the funniest bonus stages in the whole series because you literally just jump off a building and then land perfectly at the end like a cat. Anyway, no matter how many lives you get, the final boss of this game is a serious pain in the ass, and you'll have to start the whole fight from the beginning anytime you die. I'll say one thing about Shadow Dancer. Quickly learn to recognize the attack patterns of the 3 color-coded ninjas, because they will be causing you all kinds of trouble throughout the game. And in the end, you'll face the gray ninjas who have the attack patterns of any of those other 3. As difficult as it was, I did manage to beat it reasonably quickly. The Genesis port has some of the best music from the Shinobi series, and it really captures the atmosphere of some of the stages. What is more, nearly every stage has something going on in it. The game goes hard from the get-go as you fight your way through a flaming city. Manhole covers burst open with geysers of flame. Next, you'll fight through a crumbling street, where earthquakes split the scenery. The first stage of the next mission starts out with a 3-level bridge, and the entire third stage takes place on the Statue of Liberty, complete with an elevator sequence that will seriously teach you to hate those ninjas. You claim to hate ninjas, yet you are a ninja. Curious. In the fourth stage, you'll have to deal with the level where darkness hides your enemies and the terrain. As is often the case with Shinobi games, the bosses are pretty wild. First we get this undead samurai type thing, but the next boss is a stone face embedded in a brick wall. Yes, you're fighting a wall monster. One boss is a flaming wheel. Maybe they're not that exciting, but you can't say they're not original, that's for sure. As I said earlier, Shinobi's sequels branched in 2 directions. Shadow Dancer and its port continued the system of one-hit kills, 1 type of ninja magic per stage, and combat based on an unlimited amount of shurikens. But with the release of Sega Genesis came another sequel that featured a very different system. Revenge of the Shinobi, released in 1989, is one of the earliest titles for the console. Ignoring Shadow Dancer Arcade, the game picks up where Shinobi left off. This time, Zed has been replaced by, appropriately enough, Neo Zed. They massacred Joe Musashi's clan and took his bride-to-be, Naoko, And to get her back, Joe has to go on a quest that takes him from Japan all the way to the east coast of the US. Interestingly enough, the game actually has two possible endings, good and bad, and it all depends on you figuring out how to properly fight the final boss. The two major differences between it and the previous Shinobi installments is that now your character throws kunai instead of ninja stars, and your supply is limited. You now have a health bar, but the same rule applies that you need to be hit with a weapon or attack to actually suffer damage. Items such as kunai, health pickups, ninja magic, and extra lives are acquired by breaking open these crates that appear throughout the levels, but some crates contain bombs that detonate after a set amount of time, or almost immediately if your character touches them. Jumping to higher levels or into the background is now accomplished by double jumping, and attacking while double jumping will fire off 8 kunai in an arc. Finally, you have 4 different types of ninja magic. One is a lightning shield that absorbs damage and keeps you from getting knocked back when taking hits. Another allows you to jump much higher than usual. Then you have a straightforward offensive magic attack, and finally you have a magic attack that is extremely powerful but costs you a life every time you use it. It becomes a major strategic resource because although you have to sacrifice 1 life, you do a lot of damage and you get a full health bar assuming you have any lives left. So sometimes it's a necessary trade. The game is also much longer than the previous arcade titles and has no bonus stages. Yet again, I have to highlight the music. Right from the very start, this game hits you with the main theme, the Shinobi, and it's everything this game is about. The game's composer, Yuzo Koshiro, deliberately sought out pop music that was topping charts at the time and used it for inspiration. Interestingly, one of those sources of inspiration turned out to be none other than Madonna. Although Koshiro only got inspiration from pop music, the game's graphic artists weren't so original. See, the original cartridges of Revenge of the Shinobi featured bosses and some enemies that were obviously rip-offs of various pop culture icons. You'd see Rambo, the Terminator, Spider-Man, and Batman. Yes, like they actually had Spider-Man and Batman in the game. And if you look really closely, you could even see the flamethrower from Aliens. Naturally, this got Sega into hot water, and over time they were forced to release later editions where those characters were changed. However, my Sega Genesis copy had everything but Spider-Man changed, and the reason being that Sega actually had a license for that character at the time it was made. Copyright problems aside, the game continues the tradition of unusual bosses. While the first 2 aren't very impressive, the third boss is a supercomputer that's run by this brain in a jar. Then you got this boss, which is obviously a nuclear missile truck. Despite having a health bar and not having to rescue hostages, Revenge of Shinobi still manages to be a difficult game to master. The double jump takes some practice, and there are a few truly annoying jumps you have to make later in the game. It's as if the game has been especially designed to compensate for the advantages it gave you over the original Shinobi format. But honestly, I think it's a good design. One example I saw recently concerns this really difficult jump you encounter in the Chinatown stage. To do it properly, you need to have mastered the double jump, and you should also be using your jump magic. But if you miss this jump, nothing happens. You just have to keep trying until you get it. In the next mission though, you'll encounter a long jump over water, and here it matters. There is one thing that really drove me up the wall about this game though. Just before the last level, you will have to go through this labyrinth, where you need to choose the correct series of doors to get to the end. You have to be careful not to walk in front of just any door because your character will automatically enter, and this can set you back. Honestly, I couldn't remember the sequence off the top of my head, but I can tell you this gets a bit easier if you know how to read basic kanji characters for the numerals 1 to 10. In 1993, a sequel to Revenge of Shinobi was released for the Genesis and Mega Drive, called simply Shinobi III: Return of the Ninja Master. Once again, Joe Musashi has to take on the Z organization, and this game is structured more or less like Revenge of the Shinobi, but with better graphics and a host of new techniques and abilities. Oh, and of course, did I mention the banging music? Unfortunately, in terms of items and magic abilities, you won't see any change from the previous game. Your magic is still the same, it just looks better now. The real change here is your move set. Now your character can dash and do a running slash move. They can do hand over hand while hanging from railings, wall jump, and there's this really useful diagonal jump kick move. Besides this, you can now block by holding the attack button. In Revenge of the Shinobi, you could only block attacks if you had the power up and you were moving forward. Now you can do it stationary with or without the power-up. And speaking of power-ups, they're all pretty much the same, but now the bombs have a little timer on them, so you can see how close they are to detonation. It comes in handy sometimes. Apart from your different moves, the game mixes up some action with some very different stages. In the second mission, you actually start off riding a horse, and you fight ninjas while jumping over fences. Later, you'll get to ride a powered surfboard as well. The biolab level has you sinking into this weird mass of flesh while this monster tries to target you with its laser weapon. And there's a kind of continuity as you fight the same monster as the boss of the whole stage immediately after. The levels have a lot going on in both the foreground and background. Unfortunately, they just had to bring the stupid labyrinth level back. But to their credit, this time you don't need to worry about accidentally going in the wrong door. While Shinobi 3 was impressive for its time, it actually got rather lackluster reviews. Having played it again recently, I can kind of see why. Despite the graphical improvements, the new levels, and the new moves, it's still pretty much the same game as Revenge of the Shinobi. Some new power-ups or new magic, even if it was just cosmetically different, would have made the game stand out more. Also, the game came out at a time when arcades were becoming dominated by fighting games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, rather than platformers like back in the days of the original Shinobi. When it came to home systems, Shinobi 3 was released not too long before the release of the home ports of both Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat for the console. Tough competition. This, of course, did not spell the end of Shinobi. It would go on to have ports to various systems, including Sega's lackluster Saturn system, and even Nintendo platforms like the Game Boy Advance. But the closest thing to a comeback would be on the PlayStation 2 in 2002. Called simply Shinobi, the reboot has very little to do with the previous game, save for the inclusion of the Oboro clan and a secret cameo by Joe Musashi. You play as Hatsuma, an Oboro clan ninja on a mission of vengeance fighting against demonic hellspawn who have taken over Tokyo. The game is basically a third-person hack and slash with an emphasis on melee combat rather than shurikens. You still have them in this game, only now they just stun enemies while you dispatch them with your sword. Early in the game, you acquire a cursed blade known as the Akujiki, which feeds off the souls of those you kill with it. This creates a challenging mechanic as you need to continually kill enemies, otherwise the Akujiki will drain your own health. On the plus side, however, the sword becomes more powerful the more enemies you kill in one go. This technique becomes essential when fighting some of the game's latter bosses. Hatsuma is extremely mobile, able to run on walls, double jump, and dash around enemies. It takes some getting used to, but the game's early levels give you a chance to practice. I had this game briefly, and as frustrating as it was, it gets a lot easier once you understand and master its kill chain system. I have to admit it was a bit disappointing because it really doesn't remind you of the original games apart from the story, and the fact that it has ninjas. Rather than remaking one of the original games with modern tech, this really just feels like a totally different game that has the Shinobi label slapped on it. To understand what I mean, try contrasting this game with Contra Shattered Soldier from around that same time. This was a game that utilizes advances in technology, but was unmistakably a Contra game. PlayStation 2 Shinobi was a decent game for its time, and it even got a sequel called Nightshade. Both games are challenging, but in a certain sense, that's one more thing they have in common with the original series. In fact, that may be their most solid connection. It's very easy to write off the Shinobi series as excessively difficult or even unfair, and lump it in with a lot of those 80s and 90s games. But having played through some of these games again recently, I can't totally agree with that. In reality, Shinobi games required you to fully master their mechanics, from controlling your jumps to utilizing the level terrain to your advantage. And once you do master that, the game becomes not only much easier, but you can be unfair yourself at times. Just a couple examples. In this junkyard level, there are places where your shurikens will pass through the stacked cars, allowing you to hit enemies while in cover. Or this highway stage becomes far easier as soon as you notice that the only car that can hit you, the red one, will always come after the blue car passes. And even in Shadow Dancer, which is one of the hardest in the series, you find ways to quickly deal with these ninja enemies by slashing some of them off screen before they can attack. Looking back on the Shinobi series, it really is an example of one of those things that is wildly popular in its time, but then manages to completely fade from view as it continues to limp on. I remember when it seemed like every decent arcade had a Shinobi cabinet in it, and yet I can't remember ever seeing it referenced, and I've never heard someone in my age range bring it up. In pop culture, we've been living through an era of artificially manufactured nostalgia for the 80s, aimed primarily at getting that sweet late Gen X, early millennial cash. And in one of my earlier videos, I vented my frustration at this cynical cash grab ploy, most embodied by things like Ready Player One or Stranger Things. See, I like nostalgia for my childhood as much as the next guy, but the 80s I see reflected in modern pop culture isn't the 80s I remember. Instead, it's just a writer or director showing you some of the most wildly popular things from that era and rhetorically asking you, "Hey, remember this? You remember Ghostbusters?" Yeah, do I remember one of the most successful franchises of that era? Of course I do. How could I not? But what about the things that were popular at the time but fell by the wayside? These things had a big influence in people's lives. And I have a lot more respect for nostalgia bait when the creator references something that had personal meaning for them, even if I didn't quite have the same connection. I realize that nostalgia bait is likely here to stay, but as we transition from 80s nostalgia to 90s nostalgia for a younger generation, it'd be nice if creators could put some of their own heart and soul into their work. Show me a reference to something that makes me Google it later, instead of just dropping titles like Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat. Oddly enough, the thing that sticks with me most from this series is the music. Some artists have done great work remastering and remixing the original soundtracks, and I've included some of my favorite versions in the description for this video. I still have some of them in my playlist, so I guess there are some things you just don't outgrow. I never did end up buying any Ninja Stars. Oh well. Well folks, I hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane. Unfortunately, I've got a long trip ahead of me, but you might want to check out my back catalog. There's a lot of videos out there not many people saw because the channel wasn't monetized at the time. Maybe you'll see something you remember fondly. Also check the description below where you can find a link to my Patreon page, and as always, I ask you to click like and subscribe, and I will catch you from the other side of the world.